mother was humiliated by a millionaire while trying to get money for her son's cancer treatment. When she arrived at the hospital, she was shocked by what she saw. Miguel, an 8-year-old boy, was alone in the small kitchen of the house, determined to prepare something special for his mother, Abigail. The house was modest, with peeling walls and a worn table, but Miguel always found ways to make it cozy. He stirred the few ingredients available in the fridge, carefully choosing what he could turn into a simple dish that would make his mother smile. The idea of surprising her made him feel useful, as if he could alleviate some of the weight she carried. The late afternoon light came in through the window, illuminating Miguel's frail face. Despite his age, he seemed older than he should, with slightly drooping shoulders and eyes that showed premature maturity. He carefully cut the vegetables, his small knife sliding across the cutting board with effort. "She deserves something good after such a hard day," he muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt. "I'll do this for her." But suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his body. It started as a twinge in his stomach, which quickly rose to his chest and head. Miguel stopped for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. His breathing became heavy, and he felt the world around him start to spin. It must be just tiredness, he thought, trying to ignore the discomfort. He continued cutting the vegetables, but his hands began to tremble. The knife fell to the floor with a clang, and Miguel put his hand to his head, feeling a wave of dizziness overcome him. "No, not now," he whispered, trying to lean on the sink. But his legs grew weak, and he took a step back, stumbling on the kitchen rug. His eyes searched for something to grab onto, but it was too late. Miguel fell heavily, the side of his head hitting the ceramic floor. The cutting board tipped over, spilling the vegetables onto the floor while the boy lay motionless. The silence of the house was broken only by the sound of the clock on the wall, marking the agonizing seconds that followed. Minutes later, Abigail arrived home, exhausted from another day of work at the market. Her hands were full of bags, and her face showed the weariness of someone who spent long hours on her feet, dealing with customers and carrying boxes. "Miguel," she called out as she entered the door. "I'm home." But there was no answer. The unusual silence made a feeling of unease grow in her chest. "Miguel," she called again, now with a more worried tone. When Abigail entered the kitchen, what she saw made her heart stop. Miguel was lying on the floor motionless, with a thin line of blood trickling from the side of his head. The vegetables were scattered around him, as if he had tried to finish something before falling. "Oh God, Miguel!" Abigail cried out, letting the bags drop to the floor. She ran to him, kneeling beside her son. "My love, please wake up." Her hands trembled as she touched his face, trying to find any sign of life. Abigail's heart seemed about to burst with despair as she checked Miguel's pulse. It was weak, but it was there. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I promise you'll be okay." With tears streaming down her face, Abigail tried to lift him, but he was heavier than she expected. She cried for help, her voice echoing down the silent street. "Someone, please help me, my son needs help." A neighbor heard the cries and ran to the house. "Abigail, what happened?" he asked, alarmed at the scene in the kitchen. "He fainted." "Fell?" "Hit his head," Abigail replied, sobbing. "I don't know what to do. Please help me get him to the hospital." The neighbor helped Abigail carry Miguel to a taxi parked on the street. During the ride, Abigail held Miguel's head in her lap, murmuring words of encouragement even though she knew he couldn't hear her. "You're strong, my love," she said as tears fell from her eyes. "You'll get through this. I promise." At the hospital, the emergency room was full, but the severity of Miguel's condition ensured he was seen immediately. Doctors and nurses rushed to place him on a gurney, while Abigail was left behind in the waiting room. She sat in a plastic chair, clenching her hands so tightly that her fingers turned white. Time seemed to drag on, and every second without news was torture. Finally, a doctor appeared, calling her name. Abigail jumped up quickly, her eyes fixed on him. "How is he? Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice full of anxiety. "His initial condition is stable," the doctor replied, his tone serious. "The fall caused a hematoma, but we were able to control that. However, we found something more concerning during the tests." Abigail felt the ground disappear from under her feet. "Concerning? What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "We found an abnormal mass in Miguel's brain. We need to run more tests, but there are strong indications that it could be a tumor. It may be cancer." The word echoed in Abigail's mind like thunder. She took a step back, grabbing the chair to keep from falling. "Cancer?" she repeated, almost unable to believe it. "No, that can't be right. He's just a child. He was fine this morning." The doctor placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I know it's hard to accept," he said, "but we need to act quickly. The sooner we confirm the diagnosis, the better our chances of treating it." Abigail shook her head, tears streaming uncontrollably. She looked at the door where they had taken Miguel, feeling a mixture of despair and determination. "I will save you, Miguel," she thought, her heart aching. "No matter what I have to do, I won't let you face this alone." As she awaited news, Abigail reminisced about happy moments with Miguel, trying to cling to any shred of hope. She thought about how he loved cooking with her on weekends, mixing ingredients with the enthusiasm of an experienced chef. She thought about how he hugged her tightly when she came home from work, always saying she was the best mother in the world. The idea of losing him was unbearable. Hours later, the doctor returned with preliminary results. "We confirm it's a tumor," he said with a grave expression. "We'll need to perform a biopsy to determine if it's malignant and the stage of the disease. The next step will be surgery to remove the mass, but it's a risky procedure." Abigail felt her legs weaken again. "He's going to survive, isn't he?" she asked, almost pleading. "We're optimistic," the doctor replied, "but it will be a fight, and Miguel will need all the support he can get." She nodded, holding back tears. "He will have it. I'll be with him every step of the way. I won't give up on him." Abigail was allowed to visit Miguel, who was now in a hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors. He slowly opened his eyes as she entered, and a small smile appeared on his face. "Mom," he said, his voice weak. "Sorry, couldn't finish the food." Abigail knelt beside him, carefully holding his hand. "It doesn't matter, my love," she said, tears streaming. "You are the most special dish of my life, and I'm going to take care of you. I promise we'll get through this together." As Abigail held Miguel's hand, she felt a renewed strength within her. She knew the journey would be long and painful, but she would do anything to save her son. And in that moment, even amidst the darkness, she found a glimmer of hope, an unwavering determination to fight for Miguel with all her might. A few days later, he was discharged and went home. On another morning, which was cloudy when Abigail heard the firm knocks on the door. She knew what was coming, but her heart still raced. When she opened it, the landlord came in accompanied by two men without even asking permission. "Mrs. Abigail," he began coldly, "the deadline is up. No payment. You need to leave today." "Please," she implored, her voice trembling. "My son is sick. I just need a little more time. We have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem," he replied, crossing his arms. "I've been more than patient. Today's the end of the line." He motioned to the men, who began packing up the family's few belongings. Miguel, sitting in a chair, tried to intervene. "My mom's trying. You can't do this to us." The landlord laughed, a dry and cruel sound. "The world's not fair, kid. Learn that early." He looked at Levi, who was playing with a toy car on the floor. "And he'll learn it too, all of you." The two men began dumping the furniture onto the sidewalk. The old bed, a broken table, everything was thrown out like trash. Abigail tried to stop them but was shoved aside. "Don't do this, please," that she screamed, but was ignored. When the last item was removed, the landlord locked the door and cast one final look at the family, now standing on the street. "Good luck. I'm done with you." And he walked away without looking back. Miguel held Abigail's hand as Levi, confused, asked, "Mom, where are we going now?" Abigail tried to answer, but shame and despair silenced her. They had been left with nothing, exposed to the cold of the street, with only each other to lean on. On one late afternoon, Miguel and his mother stopped in front of a bakery, the smell of fresh bread invading the air. Hunger made his stomach growl, and he looked at his mother, who decided to ask for help. "Good afternoon, sir. Could you give us a piece of bread?" "Just enough for the children," she asked, with a tired smile. The baker, without even looking at them, shook his head. "I don't support laziness. Want food? Go to work," he replied dryly. Miguel hung his head, feeling tears well up. He wanted to understand what was wrong with just asking for food to satisfy his hunger. Later, They stopped in front of a market. Miguel's mother tried again. "Sir, my son is sick. Just a little food, please." The man looked at her with a look of disgust and laughed. "Sick? You just want an excuse to do nothing. Kids or not, you only know how to beg," he said, quickly walking away. Miguel felt his cheeks burn with shame as his mother lowered her gaze, squeezing his and his brother's hands to leave. In a square, Miguel approached a lady carrying a bag full of fruits. He hesitated, but hunger made him take the risk. "Ma'am, can you please give me an apple?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the shiny fruit. The woman turned around, surprised, and soon an ironic smile appeared on her face. "Do I look like a charity institution by any chance? I'm not obliged to feed those who are on the street. And besides, children should have decent parents who take care of them. Go away before I call someone to get you out of here." Miguel took a step back, feeling small and ashamed. Another day, when they tried to take shelter under the marquee of a store, the security guard soon appeared, with an expression of contempt. "Look what we have here. People who have nowhere to fall dead but want to stay under my roof," he said, crossing his arms. Miguel's mother tried to argue, explaining that they were just trying to protect themselves from the cold. "Please, it's just until dawn," she begged with a weak voice. The security guard laughed. "This is not a homeless shelter. Get out of here before I call the police," he said threateningly. One morning, after a cold night when Miguel could barely sleep, he spotted a trash can full of food scraps near a cafeteria. His mother hesitated, but hunger was so strong that she decided to look for something for them. When she was about to grab a piece of stale bread, the owner of the establishment appeared furious. "Hey, drop that! I don't want my trash scattered by lazy bums," he shouted, while she quickly moved away, pulling her children away. Miguel looked back, confused, but it was just a piece of bread. "Why did he get so angry?" he asked innocently. His mother sighed, not knowing what to answer. On another occasion, a lady passed by them on the street, and seeing Miguel huddled up, she muttered loud enough for him to hear. "These abandoned children. They will surely end up delinquent. That's the future of those who live on the streets." Miguel heard that and squeezed his mother's hand, as if he was trying to seek an explanation for the humiliation he had just heard. "Mum, am I a bad kid?" he asked, his eyes shining with tears. She shook her head and hugged him. "No, my love, you are the strongest and kindest boy there is. People just speak what they don't understand." One night, which was colder than ever, Miguel huddled next to his mother, trying to shelter from the biting wind that cut through the street. He was afraid, as always. He didn't quite understand the reason, but the darkness brought him a strange anguish, a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. He felt something different from the other children he saw during the day, something that seemed to burn inside, leaving him weak and tired. "Mum," he whispered, as he pulled the edge of the old blanket they shared. "Why do I have this pain in my chest? It's hard to breathe." His exhausted mother looked at him sadly. Her face, marked by deep lines, was a reflection of a difficult life, full of losses and sacrifices. She held Miguel's hand firmly, trying to provide some comfort even though she knew she couldn't do much to ease that pain. "It's just the cold, my love," she replied, trying to smile. "When the sun rises, everything will get better, you'll see." But her tone was faltering, almost a plea. Miguel didn't believe it, but he also didn't want to frighten her with what he felt. Instead, he just nodded, squeezing her hand, seeking comfort. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of cars and the wind. Miguel watched his younger brother, lying next to them, wrapped in a thin blanket that barely covered his thin body. He felt responsible, even without fully understanding what that meant. "Mom, will my brother feel the same thing as me?" he asked in a weak voice. "I don't want him to feel this pain too." His mother averted her gaze, not knowing what to answer. Her heart was broken, but she tried to maintain hope for her children, even though she herself no longer had the strength to believe in much. "He's fine, Miguel, don't worry," she replied, caressing the boy's hair, even though she knew those words had no power to change reality. "You need to rest now, so tomorrow we can try to find something to eat." Miguel nodded, trying to ignore the pain in his chest and the fear that seemed to grow with each night. But even with his eyes closed, he continued to see that dark emptiness, the loneliness that seemed to embrace him tightly, as if time was running against him. On an especially cold night, Miguel felt his body grow even weaker. Breathing was difficult, and he felt something inside him was saying goodbye. He looked at his mother, who held his hand tightly, her eyes full of tears. "Mom, will you see me when I become a star?" he asked once more, his voice weak, almost a whisper. She nodded, holding him tenderly, as if she wanted to protect him from everything. "Yes, my love. I will see you every night." Miguel closed his eyes, feeling his mother's touch and the warmth of her love even in the midst of the cold. He surrendered to sleep without fear, knowing that somehow he would always be with them, shining in the sky like a little star, watching over those he loved. Suddenly the sky darkened even more, and a fine rain began to fall, spreading the cold to every corner of the city. Miguel felt the icy drops hitting his face, running down his forehead to his chin. He tried to take shelter with his mother and brother under a canopy, but the wind was blowing hard, and they ended up getting wet quickly. The blanket they used to keep warm was already soaked, and the cold seemed to invade their bones. Miguel huddled, hugging his own chest where he felt a strong pain, something that intensified with every breath. "Mom, my chest hurts again," he whispered, his teeth chattering from the cold. His mother hugged him, pulling him closer, but her face showed concern. She rubbed his arms, trying to warm him up, even though she knew it was useless. "It will pass, my love. It's just the cold. Soon it will stop raining," she said, her voice trembling, although deep down she knew Miguel's pain was something deeper. Miguel took a deep breath, feeling the cold air hurting even more. He looked at his mother's tired face and in a moment of courage whispered, "Mom, I think I'm going to die." Those words came out softly, as if he was afraid to say them, but his mother heard them like a scream. She held his face, looking directly into his eyes, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, Miguel, you won't. I'm here with you, you're strong. It will pass, you'll see." But Miguel felt the truth differently, a certainty that the cold and pain seemed to reinforce with every second. He looked at the grey sky and asked softly, "If I die, I'll become a star, right, Mom? Like you said?" His mother nodded with a smile that couldn't hide her sadness. "Yes, my love, but you won't become a star now. You still have a lot of time with me and your brother." She hugged Miguel tighter, trying to push away her fear as the rain continued to fall, making the night even darker. The rain persisted, heavy and relentless, and Miguel's family had no choice but to lie down on the wet and cold sidewalk. With his body exhausted, Miguel huddled next to his mother and brother, trying in vain to warm himself up. His mother hugged him tightly, doing her best to protect him from the cutting wind, but the little warmth they managed to generate was insufficient. The blanket was already soaked, and the cold invaded every part of Miguel's body, making the pain in his chest more intense. At some point in the early morning, Miguel woke up to the sound of footsteps and looked towards a restaurant across the street. He saw a man leave through the back door, carrying a black garbage bag, and watched curiously. The man looked around, then threw the bag into a dumpster and went back inside the restaurant. Miguel, his stomach aching with hunger, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was something there he could bring to his mother and brother. Quietly, he got up, trying not to wake them, and walked slowly to the dumpster. The ground was wet and cold, and he shivered with every step, but his hunger spoke louder. As he approached, he saw that the bag was open, revealing pizza crusts and some poorly used pieces that had been discarded. He looked around to make sure no one saw him, and began to grab what he could carry with his small hands. Miguel felt a pang of joy mixed with the cold that froze his hands. "This will help Mom and my brother," he thought, trying to smile. With his hands full of pizza pieces, he quickly returned to where his mother and brother were sleeping. As he approached, he whispered, "Mom, look what I brought. I found food for us." His mother woke up startled, and seeing Miguel with those crusts in his hands, fell silent for a moment. She looked at her son's pale and tired face, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. With watery eyes, she took the pizza pieces and divided them among them, caressing Miguel's face and saying softly, "You're the strongest boy I've ever known, my love." Together, they ate those crusts with gratitude, even though they were leftovers. Miguel was lying on the ground, curled up, trying to warm himself up with what was left of his strength, but the cold was relentless. His breathing was heavy, his lungs seeming to weigh more with every breath he tried to take. The pain in his chest, which had been with him for days, now felt like an unbearable weight, and he could barely keep his eyes open. The fine rain that fell made his bones ache, and despite having eaten the pizza leftovers, the emptiness inside him seemed to widen, deeper than his own hunger. The mother hugged him, trying to warm him with the little energy she still had. "You'll be okay, my love, you just need to rest. I'm here, don't worry," she murmured, her voice trembling and full of pain. But deep down, she knew she couldn't promise anything. Cancer was devastating her son, and their living conditions on the street only made everything worse. She tried to push that thought away, clinging to the hope she had left, but reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Miguel tried to speak, but his voice came out weak, almost inaudible, as if each word were an extraordinary effort. "Mom, I'm so tired," he whispered, his head resting on her chest. The mother tightened her arms around him, feeling him growing colder, his breathing becoming slower and more irregular. His eyes were dull, and she knew, no matter how hard she tried to deny it, that he was on the verge of passing out. "No, Miguel. Don't leave me, please," she cried, more to herself than to him. Her voice was trembling, but she tried to stay calm, trying to convey confidence to her son, even though inside she was completely shattered. "Stay with me, my love. Stay here. I can't lose you." She caressed his forehead, trying in vain to warm that thin, fragile body. But Miguel's fever was too high, and the warmth she tried to convey seemed to slip through her fingers. Miguel's eyes were closed now, his body leaning heavier against his mother, and a feeling of deep anguish took hold of her. He was no longer responding, his body too still, his breathing so faint she could barely hear it. She brought her hand to his face, touching his cold skin, trying to wake him up, but he didn't react. "Miguel, Miguel, please, my love, wake up. You can't leave me. Please, you can't." Panic spread through the mother's heart, and she felt a knot in her throat that seemed to want to choke her. She knew she was losing her son, but she wasn't ready for it. The fear that he might leave at that moment made her body tremble as she continued to gently rock him, trying to bring Miguel back. He was so pale, his lips purple from lack of oxygen, and his breathing as faint as a thread of life about to break. The rain continued to fall, cold and incessant, as if the very sky was crying over the tragedy unfolding. Miguel's mother, desperate, hugged her son's body even tighter, crying silently. She knew he was suffering, and there was nothing she could do. The words she used to comfort him no longer had any strength, and the minutes felt like an eternity. The night was dark, but no darker than the anguish she felt inside. The next day, the sun had barely risen when Miguel's mother, exhausted but with an uncontrollable despair, picked up her son in her arms and carried him down the street. He was unconscious, his body still, his breathing faint and irregular. Each step she took seemed harder, as if the weight of her grief was amplified by the burden of her son. The biting wind and cold had not subsided, but she no longer cared. What mattered now was getting to the hospital, finding some kind of help, a doctor who could do something for Miguel. Even without strength, she had no choice. They arrived at the hospital close to noon, and the mother rushed in, drawing everyone's attention with her visible despair. The receptionist, looking at Miguel's condition, showed no sign of compassion. She just looked at the mother impassively, with a cold stare, as if dealing with yet another case of homeless people wanting medical assistance without being entitled to it. "You'll have to wait, ma'am. The line is long and this is not an emergency case," said the receptionist, not looking directly at her as if trying to avoid the gravity of the situation. Miguel's mother didn't know what to do. Her son's body was ice cold, and the fever was starting to return. "But he needs help now, please," she pleaded, but the receptionist interrupted her. "We can't do anything if you don't fill out the form first." "You'll have to wait your turn," the receptionist replied, not changing her tone of voice. Desperate, the mother looked around, searching for any help, but no one seemed to care. Finally, she managed to fill out the form, trembling with nerves and tears in her eyes. They were led to a dirty waiting room, where other patients were, some waiting in silence, others complaining of pain, but all seemed indifferent to Miguel's situation. The mother sat down with him in her lap, her hands clutching the small, lifeless body, as if it were her only connection to the world. After what seemed like an eternity, a doctor finally appeared. But upon seeing Miguel, he looked at the mother with a disdainful gaze, almost as if she were unworthy of his attention. "Another one of those cases? Ma'am, you have to understand that we're overcrowded. If he's like this, it means his condition isn't as serious as you think. We'll see what we can do, the doctor said with a cold and clinical tone. The mother felt humiliated, as if her pain and despair were an inconvenience to everyone there. But he's not well, he has cancer. Please do something. She felt the words coming out with difficulty as the anguish grew inside her chest. The doctor gave Miguel one last look and sighed impatiently. Ma'am, you don't understand, but I can't do anything without an examination. He's in a difficult situation, but he's stable. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other patients. It was then that, overhearing the conversation, an older doctor entered the room. He had a more serious expression, but also showed compassion. What's going on here? He asked, looking directly at Miguel's mother. The receptionist, surprised by the intervention, just took a step back, not knowing what to do. The older doctor approached Miguel and looked at him carefully, touching his pulse and observing his pupils. This boy needs urgent tests. Let's check what's happening to him, said the doctor, ignoring the other who was ignoring him. He asked for Miguel to be taken to the emergency room for a more detailed examination. Miguel's mother couldn't believe it. Someone finally cared. She followed the doctor to the examination room, still not understanding how all this was happening. Miguel, still unconscious, was in her arms, and she prayed silently that perhaps, finally, something would be done to save her son. After a few quick tests, the doctor came back with a grave look. His tumor is very large. It's at a very advanced stage and is compromising several organs. His situation is critical. We need to start treating him immediately, but the care will be intensive. Miguel's mother felt a wave of relief, mixed with indescribable terror. I already knew, she whispered, her voice faltering. I already knew it was cancer. He was already so weak, but I didn't know it would be so fast. The doctor, his expression softer now, placed his hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, you did the right thing by bringing him. We'll do what we can to relieve his pain and give him the best possible chance. We can't promise miracles, but we'll try. Miguel's mother didn't know what to feel anymore. The humiliation she suffered at the hospital entrance now seemed like a distant nightmare, and the pain she felt seeing her son in that condition was unbearable. But at least there was a small glimmer of hope. She knew that perhaps Miguel's struggle wouldn't be in vain, and that he still had someone to fight by his side. She grabbed Miguel's hand tightly, determined to accompany him until the end of this battle. The doctor, now calmer and more focused, began adjusting the devices around Miguel. He placed an oxygen mask over the boy's face and checked his vital signs, watching the monitor screen closely. Miguel's mother stood by his side, her hands clasped in her own lap, trying to absorb everything that was happening. The tension on her face was evident, but there was a slight relief in knowing that someone was finally doing something to help her son. You have to be strong now, little one, the doctor murmured, more to himself than to Miguel. He adjusted the intravenous medications and made some notes on the chart. We'll do what we can, stay with him. Miguel's mother was lost in thought, watching her son with a heavy heart. She didn't know how much longer she would have with him, but she couldn't help but worry about everything he had been through up until that moment. Her eyes were filled with a silent despair, but she tried not to show it to Miguel, for she knew he was watching her all the time. It was then that, against all odds, Miguel moved his fingers, as if he was starting to wake up. His breathing, which had been irregular before, stabilized a bit, and he began to slowly open his eyes, blinking as if the bright light of the environment was too much for him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak, as if he was trying to remember where he was. His eyes were glazed, but he struggled to fix his gaze on his mother. "Mom, have you eaten?" The mother, surprised and emotional, leaned closer to him, gently touching his forehead. "Miguel, my love, you're waking up. It's okay. You're in the hospital now, and you're going to be fine. You don't need to worry about me." Her voice was trembling, but she tried to give him a comforting smile, trying to convey as much calm as possible. Miguel looked at her with tired eyes, still somewhat confused, but insisting on the same question. "Mom, have you eaten? Are you hungry?" He spoke with such pure, innocent sincerity that his mother felt her heart tighten even more. The little one, so debilitated, still cared about her, even when he was so weak and frail. The mother swallowed hard, feeling a lump in her throat. "Yes, I've eaten, my love, I've already eaten." But what's important now is you. You need to rest and you'll get better soon. She tried to calm him, but her voice was full of emotion mixed with immense pain. Miguel, without fully understanding what was happening, smiled weakly. I'm going to be okay, Mum, he asked in a thin voice, his words almost inaudible. She held his hand tighter, feeling how small and cold it was. I'll be here with you, my love, always. We'll get through this together. I love you, Miguel. Everything will be okay. The doctor, who was watching the scene from a distance, approached and with a gentle look said, He's stable for now. We'll keep him under observation, but with proper treatment, he may get through this. We still have a long way to go, but it's a fight we can face. The doctor gestured to the mother, asking her not to despair, but the situation was still critical. He is strong, and he has you. That is already a great strength. Miguel's mother, her chest tight, looked at the doctor, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. She still didn't know what the future held for her son, but she knew that, at that moment, the only thing she could do was to keep fighting by his side. Miguel, with his eyes starting to close again, gave a soft sigh and snuggled against his mother, seeking the comfort of her embrace. Mum, he whispered once more, before falling asleep again. I love you. And as he slept, his mother stayed there, holding his hand with all her might, promising herself that she would do whatever it took to keep him by her side, never letting him feel the weight of the world. Time passed slowly as Miguel slept, his little shoulders rising and falling irregularly, while the monitor continued to beep, indicating that he was alive, but still in grave danger. Miguel's mother couldn't take her eyes off him, feeling a tightness in her chest with every breath he took, as if the air was heavier. The doctor was still in the room, performing a series of quick tests and adjusting the machines around Miguel. He was trying to give him the best possible chance, but the severity of the boy's condition was clear. The monitor next to Miguel began to beep more frantically, interrupting the heavy silence of the room. Miguel's mother stood up instantly, her heart racing, fear taking over her. What's happening? She cried, desperation filling her voice. The once calm doctor quickly approached Miguel, his eyes fixed on the monitor screen. He's going into arrhythmia. The tumor is pressing on the heart area and that's affecting his heart function. His voice was grave, not hiding the gravity of the situation. He turned to the nurses, shouting orders as he tried to stabilize Miguel's condition. Prepare the medication to stabilize his heart rate and increase the sedative dosage. We need to prevent him from going into collapse. The doctor spoke rapidly, his hands working with precision as the nurses rushed to follow his instructions. Miguel's mother stood paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Miguel's body was now being shaken by spasms, his skin pale and cold, sweat mixing with the rain still falling outside. She felt a wave of panic overtake her. Please, don't take him away from me. He can't leave, please don't leave me alone, she muttered through tears, despair flooding her being. The doctor didn't respond directly, his expression focused, but his voice had a firmness that sought to convey some hope. We're doing everything we can. He still has a chance, but we need to act quickly. His situation is more serious than we imagined. He administered the medication swiftly, adjusting Miguel's position on the bed and checking the monitors attentively. The tension in the room was palpable, and the sound of Miguel's labored and irregular breathing echoed in his mother's ears. She felt helpless. There was nothing more she could do but wait. The fear of losing her son seemed an unbearable weight, and she struggled to remain calm as the doctor and nurses worked frenetically. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the monitor began to register an improvement in Miguel's vital signs. The arrhythmia began to subside, and his heart returned to a normal rhythm. The doctor, still tense but visibly relieved, sighed and stepped back slightly from Miguel's bed. He looked at Miguel's mother with a serious demeanor, but conveying a slight sense of relief. We've managed to stabilize the situation. He's out of immediate danger, but it's still very delicate. The tumor is too large and pressing on several vital areas. We need to act quickly to start the proper treatment, the doctor said, his voice softer now. Miguel's mother, though exhausted and with red eyes from crying so much, couldn't contain her tears of relief. She held Miguel's hand tightly, looking at him as the monitor emitted a steady and calm sound, signaling that he had made it through another crisis. You'll be okay, my love. I won't leave you ever, she whispered. Although she knew the road ahead would be harder than she had ever imagined, the doctor, sensing her weakness, placed a hand on the mother's shoulder, trying to comfort her. "We'll start the treatment soon and we'll do our best. But you need to be prepared. It won't be easy, but if he's strong, we have a chance." Miguel's mother looked at him with gratitude, but her heart was still heavy with the weight of the unknown. The cancer was advanced, and she didn't know how much longer she would have with her son. The only thing she knew for certain was that she wouldn't leave him alone no matter what happened. The doctor stepped away to make further adjustments to the procedures and leave Miguel's mother with a moment of rest. She sat down again beside her son, her eyes fixed on him, trying to memorize every small detail, every breath, every movement he made. Their fight was only just beginning, and a mother's despair, knowing time is short, made her love for Miguel even more intense. She didn't know if he would emerge from that battle, but she knew that, as long as she had strength, he wouldn't be alone. The doctor, attentive to Miguel's condition, was adjusting the equipment when he looked at Abigail, seeking to better understand the situation. He noticed the tension on her face, as if she were about to collapse. "What's your name?" he asked gently, trying to alleviate some of the weight in the room while monitoring Miguel's health status. "Abigail," she replied, her voice failing as she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. Upon saying her name, something inside her seemed to break. The tears began to flow uncontrollably. She turned her back to the doctor, trying to hide her shame, but she couldn't. The pain she felt inside exploded, and she let out a sob, unable to control herself any longer. "It's all my fault. All of it," she mumbled, the words coming out between moans. "I got into debt, made wrong decisions. I put us all in this situation. I knew things were difficult, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to take care of my children anymore." She fell to her knees, inconsolable. The doctor, though surprised by the revelation, didn't interrupt. He remained silent, giving her time to speak, to try to vent. I should have done things differently. I should have sought help, found a job, something. I didn't want my children to suffer like this, but I took them to the streets, to this life of misery. They didn't deserve that. I deserved to be stronger, to be a better mother." Abigail's words were like blades, cutting her soul. She felt the guilt consuming her, with every tear that fell. The pain of knowing that in some way she was responsible for the tragic situation they were in now made her feel helpless. There was no going back. "I just wanted him to be okay," she continued, looking at Miguel, who was still unconscious in the bed. "He's so small, so innocent. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't take care of him. And now, I don't know what to do anymore." The doctor approached, placed his hand on Abigail's shoulder, trying to convey some comfort, but knowing that words would be insufficient. He didn't know what to say to ease her pain, but he also knew that there was something that could still be done. He took a deep breath before saying, "You're not alone in this, Abigail. We'll do everything we can to help Miguel. You're not alone." Even with those words, Abigail didn't feel better. She knew the situation was still critical and that the fight was far from over. But for a brief moment, she felt a slight sense of relief, as if the weight of guilt could at least be shared with someone who cared. As the doctor gave instructions on the next steps, she looked at her son again, knowing that he needed her now more than ever. As Abigail tried to recompose herself, wiping away her tears and trying in vain to keep hope alive, the door to the room suddenly burst open. A nurse came in, with a distant look and a serious expression, but something about her posture indicated a certain lack of empathy. She walked over to the monitoring desk, picking up some papers and examining them without looking directly at Abigail. Beside her, Miguel's brother, who until then had remained quiet, leaning on the chair, looked at his brother's bed with a disconsolate look. "So, this is the boy," the nurse said dryly, observing Miguel from a distance. "His cancer is quite advanced, isn't it?" She turned to Abigail, who was still looking down, trying to deal with her own guilt. "Look, I'll be honest with you. The treatment for him will cost a fortune. And if you don't even have money for food, imagine paying for that." She let out a short laugh, almost as if she were making a tasteless joke. Abigail swallowed hard, feeling the weight of humiliation grow in her chest. She was still trying to recompose herself, but Miguel's brother's look made her feel that she was no longer alone in this pain. The older boy could no longer bear the situation and blurted out bitterly, "Is that all you have to say, nurse?" "That he has no chance." He stood up, trying to remain firm, but his voice was trembling. "You're just pushing him to death like everyone has always done, and I'm not blind, Mom. You didn't do enough. Now you don't even have money to save him." The nurse looked at the boy with disdain but didn't respond. She just shrugged as if it were irrelevant. "I understand you want to save your brother, but the reality is that his chance of survival is minimal. Do you really think that with his condition, any treatment will work? It may be too late." She took one last look at Abigail, as if she really wanted to hurt as much as possible, and then turned away. "I just work here to follow the protocol." Abigail remained silent, her eyes filling with tears. She knew she wasn't doing enough, but she didn't want to admit the pain of losing Miguel. "You don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to the nurse. "He's all I have. I can't lose him." Miguel's brother, however, could no longer bear the situation. He approached his mother with anger and despair. "Do you think you'll be able to save him without making sacrifices? You can't keep living in this world of illusion, Mom. He's dying and you still haven't done anything. Now you're crying and asking for help from people who don't care." The scene became tense, and Abigail felt the weight of her older son's criticism. She knew he was right, but at the same time her guilt was so great that she didn't know how to face it. He left the room, slamming the door hard, leaving Abigail and Miguel alone again. She looked at her son's face, not knowing what to do anymore, as longing and despair took over her heart. Now, more than ever, she knew that the struggle was against something bigger than Miguel's cancer. It was against the choices she had made, against the abandonment of her older son, and against the cruel system that seemed not to care about them. She sat down beside Miguel without answers, but with the certainty that the fight was only just beginning. As the silence enveloped the room, Miguel's younger brother, who had been quiet until then, looked at his mother with wide eyes, still full of doubts and fear. He timidly approached her, with his small hands gripping the edge of the bed. The atmosphere was heavy, and the sounds of the hospital seemed more distant as time passed. "Mom," he called, his voice trembling, his lips quivering with a question he had been keeping for some time. "Will Miguel stay alive?" He looked directly into Abigail's eyes, his eyes so innocent, but already filled with a pain he should not bear so soon. Abigail was paralyzed for a moment, her heart aching at hearing that question. She wanted to be able to give a clear, reassuring answer, something that could ease her youngest son's fear. But the words simply wouldn't come out. She didn't know if Miguel would have the strength to continue. She didn't know what the future held. She took a deep breath, trying to disguise the pain, but her face gave everything away. I don't know, my love," she said with a choked voice. "We're doing everything we can, but what's going to happen, no one can say." She stroked the boy's hair, trying to convey a confidence she herself no longer felt. "But whatever happens, we'll be together. Miguel knows you're here, and that's already very important to him." The younger brother still looked at her with an expression of total insecurity. "But are you going to let him die, Mom? Aren't you going to do anything?" He spoke in a louder tone, feeling the pain of a child who can't understand his own feelings, but already finds himself facing a cruel reality. Abigail swallowed her tears, feeling the weight of her youngest son's words crushing her chest. She looked at Miguel, unconscious in bed, and knew she couldn't let him feel that kind of fear. "I'll do everything I can, son. Everything. I won't leave anything behind, I promise. I'll fight for him until the end." But even as she said that, the words felt empty to her. She didn't know how much strength she had to keep going. The guilt of not having done more, of not having prevented things from getting to this point, seemed to consume her. And her youngest son's question, with such purity and hope, made her realize that at some point, she too needed a miracle. Abigail left the hospital to try to get the money for her son. She walked the streets, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold morning wind made her hair fly, but she didn't care about the weather or the pain in her legs. Each step she took brought her closer to a place she had sworn never to return, her father's mansion. The house, imposing and cold, stood at the top of a hill like an isolated castle, reflecting the distance between her and the family she had left behind. She stopped in front of the iron gates, looking at the enormous property. Memories of a distant time when she was a spoiled, hopeful child surfaced, but those feelings were soon replaced by the urgent need to save Miguel. She had nothing left. If there was anything she could do, it would be this last desperate act. To ask for help from her father, the man who had always despised her, the man who made her feel smaller, as if she were a burden in his life. Taking a deep breath, she rang the gate bell. The sound echoed through the heavy silence like a sentence. When the gatekeeper opened, Abigail didn't hesitate. She went straight to the point. "I need to speak with my father. It's urgent." The gatekeeper, unsurprised, merely nodded with a tired motion. "You know he doesn't like to be disturbed. It can't be anything important." "Let me talk to him," Abigail insisted, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "It's about my son's life." The gatekeeper looked at her for a moment, studying her expression. There was no more time to waste. He knew what to do. Without further words, he led her to the main door, where a servant opened it for her. The atmosphere inside the mansion was cold, luxurious, and extremely impersonal. Abigail could barely breathe. She felt the tension rising, but knew she couldn't back down. Finally, the path led her to her father's office, where he was sitting behind a massive, dark wooden desk, looking at some papers with disinterest. The imposing-looking man raised his eyes from his documents as she entered. His eyes showed no surprise, only indifference, as always. "Abigail," he said in a low, almost disdainful voice, "what are you doing here? This is not your place." She swallowed her anger, feeling each of his words like a sharp blade. "I came because I need money. Miguel is sick, he has cancer, and I can't afford the treatment. I need you to help me. I need you to save my son." The man was silent for a moment, looking at her with the same cold, calculating gaze. He slowly set his pen down on the desk, stood up and walked to the window. Outside the day was clear, but inside the office the darkness seemed to grow. "You think that, after everything, I should care about you, or your son? After everything you did, after abandoning me, after all the shame you caused me?" Abigail felt her stomach churn at those words. Each sentence was like a punch in the face. "I know what you think of me," she said, her eyes closed, trying to control herself. "I know you never liked me, but this has nothing to do with that. I just want to save my son, and you have the money. You can save him." Her father turned around, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "You really think I'm going to throw my money away to save someone like you, Abigail? You've always been a disappointment. Now you come to me asking for help after everything that happened. No, I have nothing more for you. You will never have anything from me again." She felt the anger growing inside her, an anger she didn't know still existed. But the pain of hearing those words, of seeing the contempt written on the face of the man she once called her father, made her waver. "You're the only one who can do something. It doesn't matter what you feel about me. You have the power to save my son, and you're going to choose to do nothing." He gave a scornful smile as if he was enjoying her humiliation. "You've always been a fraud, Abigail, and your son. He's not my problem. Go away." The words stuck in her throat. She knew it was useless, but she couldn't leave without trying one more time. "You're going to let me walk out of here knowing that your grandson might die because of you?" He didn't move, his face impassive. "Yes, and that doesn't change anything." With a heavy heart and tear-filled eyes, Abigail took one last look at the man who had never truly been her father and turned away. There was nothing more to be done. She knew the battle was hers alone now. As she left the mansion, feeling the weight of her defeat, all that remained was pain and helplessness. She no longer knew what to do to save Miguel, but she couldn't give up. Not now. Abigail walked down the street, with the weight of his words still echoing in her mind. Her father's contempt, his harsh and cruel words, made her steps sound heavier with each movement. The city was indifferent, people passing by without even looking at her suffering. With hope nearly fading, she stopped in front of a trash can, her stomach growling from lack of food, but the urgency of Miguel's situation taking over her thoughts. She crouched down beside the trash can and looked around. The scene was cruel, begging for money, pleading for any coin that could give her a chance to save her son. With a choked voice, she approached people, her desperate words mingling with the sound of honking horns and hurried conversations around her. "Please," she said, holding the hat with trembling hands, "just a coin, please. My son is dying. He has cancer, and I can't afford the treatment. I need help, please." Some people didn't even look at her. Others walked past quickly, clutching their wallets more tightly. "Go beg elsewhere," a man said scornfully, pushing her aside. A group of young people laughed and made jokes about her situation, completely ignoring the suffering she was going through. "Look, another beggar. There's always someone trying to take advantage of other people's goodwill," one of them commented, mocking Abigail's situation. She felt her pride shatter with each refusal, but there was no time to be ashamed. She continued, becoming more and more tired, but determined to get at least a little money. When someone finally gave her a coin, she felt a small relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something could make the difference between life and death for Miguel. She looked at the money in her hands and sighed. "This is not enough. It's not enough," she murmured, already thinking about what the next step would be. It was then that, as she turned a corner, her eyes met the facade of the hospital where Miguel was admitted. Abigail's heart beat faster, and she headed there, almost without realizing that she was approaching the main entrance. It was then that she heard the cold and calculating voice of her father, who had appeared behind her like a shadow. He was there, standing next to a luxury car, watching her with an expression of disdain. "You're not good at begging, Abigail. I heard what happened and I can help you, but there's a price." She looked at him, surprised and at the same time desperate. "What do you want, father?" The question came out almost without wanting to, but already knowing that he wouldn't do anything without demanding something in return. "I can lend you the money for your son's treatment," he said, with a smile that looked more like a threat. "But there's a condition. You'll work at my house every day, without pay, without food, without rest, and you'll pay back every penny I lend you to the last one. I'll control your life until the debt is paid off." The silence between them was suffocating, the weight of his words falling on her like an avalanche. Her father's gaze was firm, as if he already knew what her answer would be, and the despair in Abigail's eyes was not enough to intimidate him. He knew she had no choice. She felt a mixture of anger and helplessness, but the image of Miguel, weak and unconscious in the hospital, invaded her mind. She had no other alternatives. "I accept," she said finally, her voice broken by pain and necessity. "I'll do whatever it takes to save my son." He gave a cold smile, as if he had just won a game. "Then, tomorrow, you'll be at my house. And don't forget, from now on you owe me your son's life. Let's see how much you're willing to pay." Abigail felt a knot tighten her throat. The idea of spending the next few days working as a maid in her own home, without rights, without food, without dignity, was humiliating, but there was no other option. All she wanted was to save Miguel, and if that meant giving in to her father's cruel whims, then she would. With her head down, she entered the hospital again, feeling the weight of her decision tightening her chest even more. She knew that the path ahead would be arduous, but she had nowhere else to run. All she could do now was move forward, pay the price she was charged, and try to save her son. The day seemed heavier as Abigail and her father headed to the hospital. She walked beside him, her steps slow and tired, the weight of the decision still crushing her chest. Her father, on the other hand, seemed calm, as if everything he was doing was simply a favor he had already calculated. He walked with a rigid posture, not even looking at her, as if the fact that he was paying for Miguel's treatment was a favor he was doing out of his own kindness, though this was far from the truth. They arrived at the hospital, where Abigail's father went straight to the counter. With an authoritative movement, he took out a high-value note from his wallet and handed it to the receptionist, almost throwing the money into her hand. "This is the payment for the emergency treatment of a boy. Miguel, this woman's son," he said, his voice imposing and arrogant. The receptionist, without even bothering to look directly at him, took the money with a disapproving look and did what was necessary. "The treatment will begin now. The medical team is already ready to proceed." She didn't even look at Abigail, and the indifference of the situation was like a cold blade cutting her hopes. Meanwhile, Abigail felt the humiliation growing inside her. Her father, with his superior and rude posture, seemed not to care at all about what she was going through. "Now let's wait outside," he said, without even turning to her, as if he was already tired of being at the hospital. "Do you think this is something easy? Do you think you can just come to me and expect me to fix everything?" She didn't know what to answer. The treatment was being paid for, but the price of her dignity was already being charged. They sat in the waiting area, and the silence between them was immense, heavy. Her father never looked at her, never asked a single question about Miguel or his health condition. He was there out of obligation, and nothing else. Abigail wanted to speak, to say something about how much this was destroying her, about how she felt less than nothing, but her father's presence prevented her from making any move. He didn't care about her. He never did. All he did was think about his own ego, about maintaining control, and this indifference hurt her more than any insult. "You should have behaved better in life, Abigail," he said, breaking the silence, but without really looking at her. "Now you're here begging for help because you made wrong decisions. It has always been like this with you, hasn't it? Despising everything that was given to you, throwing away opportunities. Now you pay the price for that." His words hit her like a slap. She closed her eyes, trying to control her tears. "I'm just trying to save my son," she answered, her voice weak, but full of a determination she still didn't know where it came from. "And if you helped me, it's because he's your grandson, not because you care about me." He gave a dry, ironic laugh. "Don't fool yourself, Abigail. I don't care about you, I never did. And don't delude yourself into thinking I'm doing this because of some fatherly feeling. This is all a calculation. I do this because it's what must be done. I don't want to know about feelings." She felt a wave of anger take over her body, but she knew she couldn't lose control. Miguel needed her, and it didn't matter what her father said. She had to continue for him. Time seemed to drag on until a doctor finally appeared. Other treatment has begun, but continuous monitoring will be necessary. The tumor is at an advanced stage. We cannot guarantee that he will survive, but we will do everything possible. Abigail's father looked at the doctor, his face impassive. "Do what is necessary, but remember, he has to get out of this. I have no patience for wasting time, and don't come to me with more excuses or empty promises." The doctor, visibly uncomfortable with Abigail's father's attitude, just nodded. "We will do our best, sir." After the doctor left, Abigail remained seated, still in silence, processing the doctor's words, but also her father's contempt. He paid, but the way he did it, as if it were a coin thrown to the wind, only made clear how much he hated her, how much he despised her entire family. She looked at Miguel, sleeping in the hospital bed, and knew she would do anything to see him alive and well again. But with every word from her father, she felt it more difficult to continue on that path. He made her feel small, insignificant. She knew that, as long as he was around, she wouldn't have a single moment of peace or support, and that was destroying her more than any disease. She took a deep breath, trying to gather strength to face this torment once more, but with each step she took, the weight of humiliation seemed more unbearable. She had no choice, however. The treatment was paid for, Miguel was being cared for, and she would have to endure her father's presence with his unbearable arrogance for longer than she would like. All that mattered now was Miguel. Abigail and Levi spent the night on the street, sheltered in the small corner of a busy road, where the cutting wind seemed to make time pass slower. They wrapped themselves in pieces of dirty clothes, trying to warm themselves from the immense cold that invaded their bodies, but the discomfort was greater than anything they could do. Miguel, still in the hospital, underwent a painful treatment, but with some chance of recovery, and this thought kept Abigail alive, fueling her strength to face another night of suffering. At dawn, Abigail felt the weight of Levi's body leaning against her stomach. He was sleeping, his breathing shallow, but she couldn't rest. The fear of losing her son, the pain of being on the fringes of a society that ignored her, all of this took over her thoughts. Throughout the night, she had tried to convince herself that when morning came, things would get better. But the truth was that deep down, she knew everything was far from getting better. As soon as the day began to dawn, Abigail got up with Levi and head down walked to Henry's mansion. The path seemed endless, and Abigail's heart tightened with every step. The man who caused her so much pain, the one who despised her as if she were a burden, now had the power to determine her son's fate. She didn't want to go, but she knew she had no other choice. Without Henry, Miguel wouldn't have the necessary treatment. When they arrived at Henry's enormous house, the difference between the place where they were and where they spent most of their time was brutally clear. The luxury and ostentation of the mansion made the street where they had slept seem even dirtier and more desolate. Abigail couldn't help but feel small in the face of that setting. She knew that in that place, she was nothing. She was neither a daughter nor a mother. She was just another stranger. Henry received her with his usual look of disdain. "You've come here to ask me again, haven't you?" he said, his tone cold and cutting. "Take advantage while I'm still able to help you, but don't expect me to feel sorry for you, Abigail." His voice was like a blade. Abigail knew he felt no compassion, and his words only confirmed it. Humiliation was constant, like a shadow that accompanied her, even when she tried to get away from it. "You and your stinking son will have to take a bath. I won't tolerate that street smell inside the house," he continued, pointing to the bathroom without looking at her. "And then, you'll dress properly, like someone who has a minimum of dignity. I can't have you here looking like a beggar." Abigail looked at Levi, who was standing quietly by her side, head down. He didn't understand, but his eyes were full of fear and confusion. She gently pulled him by the arm. "Come on, Levi. Let's do what he said." The two went to the bathroom, and the smell of dirt and fatigue was almost unbearable. Abigail felt that her skin could no longer endure the filth of the days on the street, but the bath seemed more of a symbolic act than something that would truly relieve her. Still, she washed her body quickly, trying to cleanse herself, trying to put some dignity back. When they left the bathroom, Henry was waiting with expensive and uncomfortable clothes, which he handed them with a gesture of disdain. "Put these on. If you don't, you won't even have the chance to stay here. I want to see dignity, even if just for a moment. It will serve for what you really are, someone who is worthless but who needs a bit of appearance." Abigail, her soul lacerated, put on the clothes, trying to hide her discomfort. They were tight and stiff, different from anything she had ever worn in her life, but she had no choice. Levi looked at her but said nothing. He knew that at that moment any word would be useless. "Now you're going to clean the house," Henry ordered with an ironic smile. "Sweep the living room, wash the bathrooms, and dust everything. Do it right, or you'll see what happens." He watched her with a cold and calculating gaze. "If you were as efficient at humiliating yourself as you are, maybe things would be different." She swallowed the words she had wanted to shout. Hatred and frustration burned in her throat, but she knew she couldn't do anything. All she had to do was follow orders and endure the humiliation so that her son would have a chance to live. She began cleaning her mind in a mixture of hopelessness and anger, while Henry continued to move around the house, giving orders and observing with a distant gaze. He sat in his armchair, from where he could see her, and did not spare harsh words. "You lost your dignity a long time ago, Abigail, and if I were you, I'd start thinking that you'll never get it back." She, with trembling hands, continued the work, but his words cut her, destroyed her. The pain of being treated that way was something she didn't know if she could endure much longer. But in her mind, the only thing that mattered was Miguel. If Miguel's treatment was the only price to pay, she would pay it. But what he was doing to her, destroying her soul, that was killing her little by little. Levi, who was watching from a distance, began to understand the gravity of the situation. His eyes were fixed on his mother, trying to find a way to alleviate her pain. But he was just a child, powerless in the face of cruel reality. There was nothing he could do, and it suffocated him. When the house was finally clean, Henry got up from the armchair and looked at Abigail with an even more sarcastic smile. "Well done. Now go away. Don't forget, if you don't follow my orders, you'll pay the price. Miguel's treatment can be the beginning of your redemption, but if you don't stay in your place, you'll regret it." Abigail, exhausted, looked at her youngest son, her heart full of pain and emptiness at the same time. She wanted to scream, wanted to break everything, but she knew there was only one path left to follow: keep enduring. And as much as she was destroyed inside, the only thing that kept her standing was Miguel. She knew he needed her more than ever. And deep down, Abigail felt that any suffering she went through would be nothing compared to what her son would have to face to survive. The morning was gray and cold, as if the universe was mourning Miguel's suffering. Abigail was sitting on a plastic chair in the hospital corridor, with her head in her hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few weeks. She looked at the other patients, each with their own stories and their own sorrows, but her burden seemed heavier with every breath. The doctor's words were still echoing in her mind, but something was about to happen that would change everything. As she tried to find some kind of foundation to lean on, a nurse walked into the room with a serious look, but at the same time, an expression of someone who was about to reveal something important. Abigail didn't know exactly what to expect, but she knew this visit wouldn't be like the others. The nurse pulled up a chair and sat across from her, avoiding looking directly at Abigail for a few seconds. She then spoke in a softer tone of voice, but loaded with tension. "I know you're going through a very difficult time, but there's something important we need to discuss about Miguel." Abigail looked at the nurse, anxious and desperate. "What is it? Is Miguel going to be okay?" The nurse hesitated for a moment before continuing, as if weighing every word she would say. "He's responding to the treatment, but we have some concerns. The cancer he has. It's not just a matter of luck. It seems there's something more. Something that may be hereditary. He's not the only one to have this. His condition is related to something genetic." Abigail, feeling her stomach turn, asked in a trembling voice, "Genetic? What are you saying?" The nurse looked at her, trying to be as gentle as possible. "Miguel's cancer has characteristics of a rare type that can be passed down from generation to generation. It's possible that you or someone in your family passed this on to him without knowing." Abigail's world seemed to collapse under her feet. She knew something was wrong, but she had never imagined that Miguel's cancer could have roots in something so deep and dark. She thought for a moment about her own health, her living conditions, everything she had gone through, even her father, Henry, and the way he had always treated her. And then the truth hit her like a punch in the stomach. "No, it can't be," Abigail muttered, more to herself than to the nurse. But as she said those words, her mind traveled back to the past, to the memories of when she still lived in her father's house. Henry had always treated her with indifference, always forced her to submit to his rules and expectations. But there was something more, something she never knew about. The idea that her father, the man she had always tried to please, knew something so important and never told her, seemed unbearable. The nurse looked at her, waiting for a reaction. "I'm sorry. The genetic test still needs to be done to confirm, but the symptoms are clear." Abigail remained silent, the weight of the revelation crushing her completely. She felt a mixture of anger and helplessness growing inside her. How could her father, Henry, have hidden such a big truth? How could he have let his daughter live through all this pain and suffering without offering even an explanation? He knew about this. My father knew, and didn't tell me anything. Abigail asked, her voice breaking with emotion. The nurse just looked at her without answers and stood up, saying she would leave the family to rest. But the words she had just heard were etched in Abigail's mind like an indelible mark. She didn't know if she felt more anger or fear. After the nurse left, Abigail went to Miguel's room where he was still unconscious, with the treatment ongoing. She sat beside him, holding his hand, and watched him for a few seconds. The thought that her son's illness could be a consequence of something genetic, something she or her father could have caused, was more painful than anything else she had faced. She closed her eyes for a moment, and with the pain gripping her chest, she murmured softly to Miguel, "I'm going to save you, my son. Even if I have to face the devil himself to do it, I'm going to save you." But what Abigail didn't know was that, as she faced this devastating revelation, her father was watching everything from afar, with a smile she couldn't see, but knew was there, waiting for the right moment to reveal even more secrets from the past. Without thinking twice, Abigail left the hospital in hurried steps and went straight to Henry's house. During the journey, her mind was 1,000 places, with the doctor's words echoing like a hammer in her head. Genetic factor, limited response to treatment. With each step, her heart filled with anger and a feeling of injustice that she could not contain. She knew Henry had always hidden facts about his health and family history, but she never imagined that the price of his silence could cost her son's life. Upon arriving at the mansion, she passed through the gates without hesitation, ignoring the guards' questions, and entered the house like a storm, unconcerned about knocking. She found Henry calmly seated in his leather armchair, as if the world outside his luxurious bubble didn't matter. He held an open newspaper, completely oblivious to his daughter's despair. "Did you know?" she blurted out, interrupting the silence with a voice laden with anger and indignation. "Did you know that your bad genetics could be the cause of Miguel's cancer? The doctor said it's genetic. You're responsible for this." Henry lowered the newspaper slowly, raising his eyes to meet her with a cold and distant look, devoid of emotion. With disdain, he replied, "You come here to blame me for your own shortcomings, Abigail. Look at yourself. A woman who cannot support her own family, who depends on me for everything. And yet you have the audacity to throw this on me? Don't pretend you're not to blame." She took a few steps forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "How many times did I hear my mother warning you about the risks of having children? You always hid everything, acting as if your perfect lineage was above others. How many more secrets are you going to hide so no one knows the damage you've caused?" Henry narrowed his eyes, visibly irritated by the accusations. He rose slowly, his posture intimidating, and looked her directly in the eyes, almost whispering, "Be careful what you say, Abigail. I've already warned you to respect the one who pays your bills. But now, since you seem so ungrateful and willing to accuse me, I think it's time to cut off your support." The reality of those words fell upon Abigail like an unbearable weight. Henry looked at her with calculated coldness and added, with a voice poisoned by resentment, "I will no longer pay for the boy's treatment. Find another way to save your son if you can." Abigail felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, the impact of rejection and contempt hitting her like a punch. Tears began to flow uncontrollably, and without thinking she let herself fall to her knees before him, her dignity crushed by despair. "Please, Father, don't abandon me now." Her voice came out almost a whisper between sobs. "I'll do anything, but don't let my son die. He's your family too." Henry observed her with a look of superiority, savoring the moment of his daughter's total submission. That's what he wanted, to see Abigail completely at his mercy, reduced to nothing. With a cruel smile, he murmured, "Anything, is it? Look at what you've become, Abigail, begging on the floor like a beggar. Perhaps this will teach you to respect me." She sobbed, tears streaming down her face as she tried to contain her despair. "I just want to save my son, please. All I ask is a chance to give him a future." Henry remained silent for a few seconds, evaluating her as if she were a disposable object. Finally, he sighed as if he were doing a favor. "Very well. I can pay for this treatment. But remember, Abigail, I'm doing this out of pure whim, not for you or the boy. Don't disappoint me again. Because next time, not even with tears will you be able to convince me." Abigail, still on her knees, felt a slight relief, but knew the price she would pay for this support would only grow higher. But the surprise was yet to come. "Now, I don't want you here all the time. You're dirty and stinking. Go clean your son and then get yourself sorted out. I don't want to see you in that state again." Henry's voice sounded like a curt order with no room for argument. She rose slowly, her eyes still full of tears. "And what else do you want, Father?" "I will pay for the treatment, yes," he said with an indifferent tone. "But I'm not going to support this beggar's life of yours. Your youngest son, the one called Levi, is going to work here. He'll clean the house and do what you can't do. And if he doesn't want to, he'll learn to do it as if it were a favor from me. I don't want to see you idling around here anymore." Abigail was stunned. The idea of putting her youngest son to work at her grandfather's house, who had always despised them, was a blow she did not expect. "But he's just a child, Dad. He's not to blame for this." Henry shrugged. "Then he learns the lesson. The rest of your family has to learn that nothing comes for free, Abigail. Now go and don't make me waste any more time." With trembling hands and a heavy heart, Abigail left the room, knowing that the life of her youngest son would now be marked by the same contempt she had always felt from her father. She would pay an even greater price for everything she had done, and what hurt the most was knowing that her children were also being dragged into this hell. Abigail was sitting in the kitchen of Henry's mansion, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her eyes, but her mind was in a distant place. She watched her youngest son, Levi, barely 8 years old, with frail arms and short legs, trying to clean the immense living room. His small hands struggled with the duster and broom, objects that seemed far too large for him, while the dirt seemed to stubbornly refuse to leave. The house was so big that no matter how hard he tried, it never seemed enough. Every move Levi made was a visible effort, his sweaty forehead and tired eyes, but he didn't stop. He dared not stop. Henry's gaze, sitting in the armchair, watching in silence, made the boy accelerate his work even more, as if time were against him, as if the simple act of breathing were an offense to the man who had forced him to do this. Abigail felt a tightness in her chest with every groan of effort that escaped Levi. But she could do nothing. She had no strength, no options. Her mind was tormented by the thought that her eldest son, Miguel, was still in the hospital, needing urgent care, while her other son was there, being treated like an employee, as if his childhood were a commodity that could be bargained. "Why don't you do it right, Levi?" Henry grumbled from the armchair, irritated. He was sitting comfortably, as if in a separate world, far from the misery and despair that surrounded the house. "I pay you to do this, so do it properly. I don't want to see any dirt on that table, are you listening?" Levi did not respond. He just nodded, cleaning even faster, trying to understand what he was doing wrong, but knew he couldn't meet his grandfather's expectations. He was just a child. The tension in the room increased, and Abigail felt every word, every look from Henry piercing her heart like sharp knives. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to Levi and hug him. Tell him that all of this was wrong, that he shouldn't be there, forced to work for a man who didn't even care about him. But fear, shame, and powerlessness silenced her. "Do you want to do this or not?" Henry asked, suddenly getting up and going to Levi. The boy froze, stopping cleaning and looking at his grandfather with wide eyes, expecting another scolding. I'm trying, Grandpa," Levi murmured, his voice weak and trembling, his eyes brimming with fatigue. He was tired, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. That's how he had learned from life on the streets. Weakness was not allowed. "Trying." Henry laughed sarcastically, giving the boy a shove that made Levi lose his balance and nearly fall. "That's not trying, boy. That's being useless. If you want me to pay for your mother's and brother's treatment, you need to learn to be useful, not a dead weight. You'll have to work much harder than that if you want respect here. And frankly, I don't see much value in you or your mother." Abigail stood up instinctively, wanting to protect Levi. But an invisible force held her in place. She felt as if she were in a glass prison, watching her youngest son being humiliated before her eyes and unable to do anything to stop it. Levi's muffled crying was like a punch in her stomach. He didn't want to be treated like this. He didn't want to be there, but he didn't know where to go, how to break free from this nightmare. "Get up and finish this job," Henry shouted, pointing to the wall where there was still a bit of dirt. "I don't pay you to rest. I want to see that house shining by the end of the day." Levi looked at his mother, a silent gaze that said more than any words. He didn't understand why he had to do this, but he knew his mother couldn't do anything. He felt such a heavy weight on his shoulders, a weight that didn't belong to a child, but that, somehow, had been placed there without his permission. Abigail, with a heavy heart and a broken heart, lowered her head. She wanted to scream, wanted to be stronger, but had no strength. She looked at the boy with eyes glazed with fatigue and humiliation, and knew that nothing would ever be the same again. What she wanted more than anything, more than saving Miguel, more than everything, was to take Levi in her arms and apologize for being so weak, for not being able to protect her children from a cruel fate. The room was filled with silence, but Levi's muffled crying seemed to echo off the walls. Abigail closed her eyes, feeling the pain of powerlessness tightening her heart even more. The lives of her children were being shredded in front of her, and she didn't know how far she would be able to go to end this humiliation. With every move, every word from Henry, she felt more lost. But she knew the worst was yet to come. Abigail, her face marked by pain and her heart heavy with guilt, couldn't hold back the words any longer. She looked at her father, lazily lying in his armchair, and let out a phrase that had been hammering in her mind for days. "This is inhumane," she said, her voice breaking with anger. "To do this to a child, Father. My son, just a child, has to work to clean your house all because of you. Do you really think that's fair?" Henry, without even moving, lowered his newspaper and looked at her with a disdainful smile. His cold gaze was as cutting as his words. "What was inhumane was your mother, Abigail," he replied, with a sharpness that almost froze the room. "When she had you, she knew there was a very high probability of passing on the cancer genetics to her children. But she never cared, did she? She always wanted to have kids, even knowing that one day someone would have to pay the price. And when you decided to leave home because of the debts you yourself caused, I knew this would happen one day." Abigail shuddered, her hand going to her mouth, as if trying to hold back the words that almost choked her. You always knew?" she asked, disbelief taking over her voice. "You always knew that one of us would get cancer? That it would be my son? And you never did anything?" Henry slowly rose, facing her with an even more palpable coldness. He took a step towards Abigail, who stood still, her whole body tense with the growing tension. "Of course I knew," he said, with a terrifying calmness. "I never said it, but I knew. Your mother had a bomb in her body, and you were the time bomb." When you went out on the street trying to escape your debts, I knew the worst would come. I didn't know which of you it would be, but I knew someone would get cancer. And now, here we are, right? Fate took care of making you pay for your irresponsibility." Those words cut Abigail like a knife. She tried to breathe deeply, trying to process what she had just heard, but everything inside her seemed to collapse. "And now you want to put all the blame on me? You want to call me guilty for everything?" "The fault is not mine, Abigail," Henry continued, anger taking over him. "The fault is yours and your mother's. You both have bad blood. That's what brought you here. Your son is not to blame, but you are. You always have been." Abigail felt the ground disappear from under her feet. Despair consumed her, but anger was even greater. She clenched her fists tightly, feeling the heat of tears burning her face. "You're disgusting," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "You never knew what it means to be a real father." Henry merely smiled, emotionless, as if he had said something completely normal. "That's what you are, Abigail. In the end, you were never able to deal with the consequences of your own choices. And now, if you think I'm going to have any remorse, you're very mistaken." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with resentment and rancor. Abigail, with trembling hands, felt a shiver that ran through her. She no longer knew what to do or think. The man who should have been her father was far from someone she could trust or even respect. "Are you going to let my son die?" Abigail asked, her voice failing, mixing anger with despair. The words came out slowly, as if each one carried the weight of years of suffering and disappointment. "Because in the end, all that matters to you is your pride and your power. Neither my pain nor Miguel's pain mean anything to you. It doesn't matter how much I beg, how much I suffer. For you, it's all a matter of control. I'm nothing more than a disposable piece in your dirty game." Henry, comfortably seated in the armchair, merely laughed. The laugh was cold, empty, like the sound of someone who had already detached themselves from any semblance of humanity. "Nothing else is relevant, Abigail. Nothing else. Now, you and your children are just pieces in my game. And as in any game, the pieces come and go. If you think I care about what happens to them, you are sorely mistaken." Abigail stood there on her knees on the floor, pain mingling with rage, swallowing any remnant of pride she had left. "I've already lost everything, Henry. My dignity, my hope, my family. And now you're telling me that even my son's life means nothing to you?" She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, but also with a fury that burned like fire. "I was made of your choices, and now you want to completely destroy me, make me even more desperate, snatching away the last chance I had to save Miguel." Henry crossed his legs, his gaze empty and calculating. "Do you remember how easy life was for you when you could count on my help? But that was the illusion, wasn't it, Abigail? Because it has always been like this. You never had control. You were always a puppet, and I always held the strings. Now you're here kneeling, begging for something that can no longer be given. You think your children are more important than my reputation, than my honor. I've already decided, and your tears won't change that." She felt the weight of his words, a direct blow to the heart. But still she couldn't stop fighting. "You were never a father, Henry. You never cared about us. You never did anything for us. All you did was throw us out on the street and then watch us as we tried to survive. And now when I need it most, you abandon us as if we were trash. It's not possible for you to be so cold, so inhuman." Henry interrupted her with an icy look. "You're right about one thing, Abigail. I was never a father. And now you're going to learn in the worst way that there is no place for weakness in the world I live in. Your pleas make no difference to me. Now you are nothing more than an obligation I will fulfill with disdain." The atmosphere between them grew heavy, laden with a mutual hatred that seemed to consume them. Abigail, as defeated as she was, felt a flame ignite within her, a determination that mingled with the pain. She was still fighting for Miguel, but she felt she was facing a losing battle, not just against her son's cancer, but against her own father's cruelty. "You never understood what it means to be a mother, Henry," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "You never felt what it is to love someone with all your strength, with your soul. This is something you will never understand. I don't know what the future holds for me, but one thing is certain. I will never give up on saving Miguel, even if it means facing you, my own father." Henry watched her for a moment, his demeanor unruffled. but a shadow of anger flashed briefly across his eyes. "I warned you, Abigail, you'll regret this. You'll see that this game is far from over. Don't expect me to give you a second chance. And remember, you made the choice to be weak. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." And with those cutting words, he rose and left, leaving Abigail there alone, consumed by suffering and revolt. She knew she was about to face an even harder battle, and that nothing, not even her unwavering faith, could stop the force of the hatred Henry felt for her. She didn't know how, but she would have to find a way to save Miguel, even if it meant facing the total destruction of everything she had left. As Abigail recovered from his words and the humiliation she had just endured, a heavy silence filled the room. She heard the cautious footsteps of Levi, her youngest son, approaching. He entered, his big eyes confused as if something weighed on him. He looked at his mother, but the expression he wore in his eyes was distant and laden with a somber sadness. "You're to blame for all of this, Mom," Levi said, his voice trembling with confusion and sorrow. "If it weren't for you, Miguel wouldn't have cancer. If it weren't for you, he wouldn't be in the hospital, not knowing what's going to happen. You brought this to our family." Abigail froze. Levi's words were like a punch to the stomach. She looked at him, trying to understand where this was coming from. Levi, just 8 years old, didn't fully comprehend what was happening. But the pain in his voice, the way he was expressing himself, left her disconcerted. "Levi, my son, it's not like that," Abigail tried to explain, her heart tightening as she saw the sad and lost expression on the boy's face. "You don't understand what's going on. Miguel has cancer because life is cruel, but it's no one's fault. Not yours, not mine." But Levi didn't seem to understand. Instead, he looked at her with pain in his eyes and repeated more firmly, "You brought cancer to him. You made this happen. You're to blame." Henry was in the room, watching the scene with a cold smile. He didn't move, but his eyes shone with a sadistic pleasure as he watched the conflict unfold. He approached Levi and knelt down to his level like a counselor. The boy, though hesitant, looked at his grandfather. "Levi, you're right," Henry said, his voice low and venomous. "Your mother made choices that led to this. She and Miguel, they're like a curse on our family. Maybe you don't realize it now, but I've always known. She was never able to make the right choices." Levi looked at his grandfather, confused, but what he was saying seemed to make sense somehow. The little boy, so naive, didn't understand the manipulation that was being made, but he felt the truth in Henry's words. The grandfather's tone, his look of contempt, made the words seem more real, more forceful. "It's not your fault, Levi," Henry continued, now with a softer voice, trying to gain the boy's trust. "You're a good boy, but look at what your mother did. She was never able to take care of you, of Miguel. This is all a consequence of her choices, and now she's putting all this burden on you, wanting you to accept the blame. But you don't have to carry that." Levi looked at his mother with a sad and confused expression, and then turned his eyes back to Henry, as if trying to understand what he was saying. He wanted to believe his grandfather those words. He wanted to understand, because everything was so messy. He was so afraid of what was happening to Miguel, and now it seemed that the blame for all of this was his and his mother's. "So you think it's my fault?" Abigail asked, trying to control the panic in her voice. "That I'm responsible for all of this? That Miguel's pain is because of me?" Henry looked at her with a victorious smile. "That's exactly it, Abigail. You're to blame. Now Levi understands. Now he knows what really happened. You brought the curse upon our family." Levi, with tears filling his eyes, looked at his mother and again repeated, "You're the reason for this. You did this to us." The words cut Abigail's heart like a sharp blade. She looked at her son, trying to understand how he, such a small child, could believe that the blame was hers. She knew he was being influenced, that he was being manipulated by Henry's cruel words, but she couldn't prevent the pain from crushing her. "Levi, please," she tried, her voice full of emotion. "It's not true. You don't understand, but you're not to blame for this. No one is. It's a matter of destiny." But Abigail's words no longer seemed to have power. Levi, confused and weakened, turned to his grandfather and mumbled, "I want Miguel to get better, but I don't know what to think anymore." Henry, observing the scene with an approving look, smiled, knowing he had managed to plant doubt in the boy's mind. He had made Levi believe that everything that was happening was his mother's fault, and now He was slowly destroying the trust that existed between them. As Abigail looked at her son, her heart broke. She knew that at that moment, she had lost something very precious. Levi's trust, his innocence, and the guilt for all of this now seemed to weigh much more than any other pain she had ever experienced. She felt as if she were losing her children in an even more painful way than Miguel's illness. She knew she needed to act quickly before Henry could further poison Levi's mind. But in her situation, without support and without strength, she found herself increasingly helpless in the face of everything that was happening. Abigail, with a heavy heart and growing anger, looked at Levi, who now seemed lost. With a vacant look and an expression of deep sadness, she felt a lump in her throat, but had no strength to argue further with Henry or explain anything to the boy. He was being manipulated, and she knew that, but at that moment she felt as if the last thing left to do was to leave. The pain was immense, but there were no more words that could reach her. "I'll go to Miguel," Abigail said, trying to hide the panic that was beginning to take over. "Stay here, Levi, don't leave." She didn't know what else to say. She didn't know how to make her youngest son see the truth. With heavy steps, she left the room, leaving behind that heavy and suffocating environment where guilt and manipulation now took over everything. She walked away, hurrying through the corridors of Henry's house, trying not to think about what was happening. With each step, her chest seemed tighter, her breathing more difficult. When she finally arrived at the hospital, her thoughts were confused, a whirlwind of feelings. She rushed in, walking to the room where Miguel was, her heart racing. Each hallway seemed longer, each step heavier. She reached the door of the room, and her hand hesitated before turning the knob. Something inside her already feared the worst. She entered slowly, and the sight of her son lying on the bed made her world crumble. The silence in the room was deafening, and the feeling that time had stopped enveloped her completely. Miguel was pale, his face now marked by a shade of pain she already recognized. The monitors were silent, and the machine that had monitored his breathing was turned off. She walked to his bedside, her eyes watering, but she couldn't cry anymore. The pain was so great that it seemed to block any other reaction. "Miguel," she whispered, taking his hand in hers. "My son, please don't leave me." But there was no answer. The boy who always cried in fear of death, the same boy who silently suffered in the hospital bed, was now quiet, motionless. His small hand no longer moved in hers, and for a moment Abigail had the feeling that she was being consumed by an endless abyss. She sat down beside the bed, too weak to get up or react. The guilt was like a physical pain, a stab in her chest. "I tried, Miguel," she spoke softly, the words coming out between sobs. "I tried in every way. I wanted so much for you to live. I wanted so much for you to be okay." She no longer knew what to do. The battle she fought to save her son had been in vain. She knew that cancer was not something that could be easily overcome, but the weight of not having been able to save Miguel, of not having done enough, became a burden that seemed unbearable. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening made her look back. The nurse entered, with a sad and professional look, but with a touch of sorrow on her face. She approached and gently placed her hand on Abigail's shoulder. "I'm sorry," the nurse said in a low voice. "He didn't make it. I'm so sorry." Abigail felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. It wasn't possible. She couldn't believe it. Miguel, her son, the little boy she loved more than anything, had left. The feeling of despair and loss enveloped her completely. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with pain, and she let herself be consumed by it. "I failed," Abigail murmured, tears streaming incessantly. "I failed, Miguel. I couldn't." The silence of the room seemed to cover everything. Miguel's death was not only the loss of a son, but the end of a struggle she would not be able to win. The suffering of her life on the streets, the sacrifices she made, the humiliations she endured, all now seemed in vain. She was alone with the weight of an overwhelming guilt, with no more strength to fight. "I did everything wrong," she thought, feeling destroyed. "I tried, but what I did wasn't enough. Nothing was enough." She slowly stood up, still holding Miguel's cold hand, and stood there in silence, allowing herself to cry one last time. She knew her life would change forever. The loss of Miguel was something that could not be erased, something she would never overcome. The pain was so great that everything around her seemed irrelevant, and the only desire she had at that moment was to go back in time, to do everything differently. But she knew she couldn't. Abigail was in a state of deep despair. The pain of losing Miguel seemed unbearable, and she could barely understand how it all had happened. She was sitting in a chair in the hospital room with a lost look, without the strength to cry or act. The heavy silence was interrupted only by the soft sound of the doctor's breathing, who approached with an expression of sorrow. "Abigail," the doctor said softly, "I'm so sorry. I know nothing will bring your son back, but I'm here to offer you something that might help. I'm going to offer you a job as an attendant here at the hospital. It's not much, but it's what I can do at this moment. Perhaps this way you can get away from the streets and take care of Levi." She raised her eyes, confused, and at the same time touched by the offer, but the sadness in her chest was overwhelming, and she could barely respond. There were no words that could express what she felt, but the doctor continued with a voice full of compassion. "I know this won't erase the pain, but you have another son to take care of, and I really hope you accept this opportunity. It's not easy, but it's a start." Abigail felt a tight knot in her throat. She knew she could no longer continue living on the streets, that she needed to do something for Levi. However, the void left by Miguel's death was still too great. Still, she accepted the job, knowing that at least it would be a way to try to improve Levi's life. Later, with the job secured, she knew she still had to face one last battle: Henry. She could no longer remain submissive to her man who had always treated her with disdain. Determined, she went to his house, her face pale and her eyes dull, but with a strength she hadn't felt in a long time. Abigail entered Henry's house with the weight of the loss on her shoulders, but at the same time, a growing strength to face everything he had done. The cold and luxurious environment of her father's house seemed even more suffocating now that she carried the pain of Miguel's death. Each step echoed as a reminder of how small she felt in the face of everything he represented. Henry was sitting in his favorite armchair, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and his feet on a footrest. When he saw her enter, he wasn't surprised. He already knew what she wanted, but his cruel smile indicated that he felt he had control of the situation. "You've come to beg once again, Abigail," he said in a sadistic tone. "I gave you the chance to save your son, but you failed. Now what else do you have to offer?" "Miguel died," she said, her voice weak but filled with anger. "My son died, and all you did was humiliate me, manipulate me, make me go through all of this. You knew I was asking for help, but what did you do? You laughed at our pain." Henry raised an eyebrow, surprised by her intensity, but quickly recovered. "So he died? I'm not surprised. As I told you before, he was weak. Cancer has no mercy. Nothing will change now." "You're so blinded by your pride, Father," Abigail murmured, almost whispering, but the anger in her eyes was visible. "And I humiliated myself before you. I debased myself, did everything you asked. I worked like a slave in your house, begged you to save my son. And now he's dead. But the blame is mine, isn't it? Just like you've always wanted." Henry laughed, a low and almost satisfied laugh. "The blame is on everyone, Abigail. Your mother knew you had the same genetic predisposition. She always knew one of her children would die young, but you preferred to blame me for everything. Now, look where that has led you. You're not going to give me anything else." "I'm no longer your slave, Henry," Abigail said, her tone now firmer, more determined. "I no longer have Miguel, and I won't do what you want anymore. I've humiliated myself enough. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to kick me out again? Are you going to throw everything in my face?" Henry fell silent for a moment, staring at her. He clearly didn't like being challenged, especially by his own daughter. But instead of becoming enraged, a wicked smile appeared on his face. "You think you can just walk out of my life like that? You owe me, Abigail. You'll continue working for me. I gave you a chance to save your son, and you failed. Now, pay the price. I won't let you leave without paying for everything you've done. I'm not your employee. I'll never clean your house again. Miguel died, and that's not going to make me your slave anymore." She stared him down, her heart heavy, but with a renewed strength. "You want me to work for you? Then take your wealth and keep it to yourself, because I won't humiliate myself anymore." Henry's face turned red with anger. He stood up from the armchair, taking a threatening step toward Abigail. "You're asking to be crushed, Abigail. You'll regret defying the only person who can still do something for you. I'll show you what happens when you mess with me." But before he could take another step, something inside Abigail broke. She was completely shattered inside, but the anger at everything he had done made her act. With unexpected strength, she pushed him back. Henry, surprised by the reaction, almost fell to the ground. She stared him down with blazing eyes of fury. "You think you can control me with money? With power? I defied you. I have nothing left to lose. You lost everything when you let my son die. And now you can keep what's left of you. I won't humiliate myself for a man like you anymore." He stood still, astonished by his daughter's strength and courage. He didn't expect such an intense reaction. Abigail turned and walked out the door, leaving him behind, motionless, speechless. But when she left Henry's house, Abigail felt that finally she had done the right thing. She was alone now, but there was a sense of relief in knowing that she no longer depended on her father. She was willing to fight, to start over. For Levi. When she arrived at the hospital door, he looked at her with eyes full of hope, but also with the weight of sadness. She knelt in front of him, the pain of loss still present, but now she felt she could give him what he needed: love and stability. "Levi, my son, I love you so much. I'm sorry. I know I failed you, but now I'm going to do everything right. I'll work. I'll take care of you. No matter what happens, we won't go through this again. I promise you." Levi hugged her, and she felt the warmth and strength of his love, as if he were saying that, even after everything that happened, they still had each other. She stood up, feeling a new determination. Later at Miguel's wake, Abigail apologized to Levi again. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she was ready to start a new future. She would honor Miguel's memory, take care of Levi, and start over. "We'll make it, Levi. Together we'll get through this." And with that, Abigail knew that despite all the pain and loss, she still had a chance to start over with her son, now away from Henry's shadow and everything he represented. Miguel's wake was enveloped in a thick silence, as if even the wind fell silent in respect for the loss that hung in the air. Abigail sat beside Levi, her eyes heavy with tears that no matter how much they wanted to fall, she made sure to hold back. Every corner of the room seemed to echo the absence of her son, the void that was now part of her reality. The coffin was there, so cold and distant, and although she was surrounded by a few people, she felt lonelier than ever. Levi's silent crying, who could barely comprehend the totality of what had happened, only increased the pain that cut Abigail's heart. She looked at him, her little one, still so fragile and unprotected, and felt a deep pang in her chest. How could she have reached this point? How had her choices led her there? The mistakes, the broken promises, and the constant struggle against a world that seemed to want to knock her down at every step. It all weighed on her, but deep down she knew there was still something she could do. She couldn't let Miguel's legacy be one of pain and weakness. On the contrary, she would make his memory a beacon that would guide her to something better. She would not give in to sadness, not anymore. She held Levi's hand tightly, feeling his soft skin and the energy, although somewhat weary, still pulsing in his young life. He was all she had now. He didn't deserve to suffer because of the choices she had made. And with the same strength that had long been lacking, she promised herself that she would start over. For Miguel's memory, who though no longer there physically would always be a part of her, and for the love she felt for Levi, she would find a way. As the silence took over the wake, Abigail felt a wave of determination grow within her. The pain would not defeat her, and as much as she had failed in many moments, now was the time to fight. She would no longer be a victim of life. She would take the reins of her destiny, because in the end, that's what Miguel would have wanted her to do. And for Levi, she would do whatever it took to ensure that he had the life he deserved, away from the streets, away from despair and humiliation. The moment that once seemed unbearable now became a milestone, a turning point for a new beginning. The motherly love she felt for Miguel and Levi would be the foundation for everything she would build from then on. She stood up, feeling her strength slowly returning. The process would be long, but she knew the first step had already been taken. She was ready to start over. The next day, Abigail woke up in a place that, not long ago, seemed like a distant dream. The small house that the doctor had offered her was modest, but there was something comforting about it. As she opened her eyes, she felt a lightness that she hadn't experienced in a long time. The silence, the privacy, the feeling of having a home, however small, made her feel a timid hope sprouting in her heart. The house was simple, with a low ceiling and an improvised bed, but for her and Levi it was all they needed at that moment. She remembered the night before, when, with an immense weight in her heart, she had brought Levi to that humble little corner, what seemed like a temporary escape from the streets, a small refuge that would help her start over. The doctor, with his generosity, had found a small place for her and Levi to stay, a shelter where they could live at least for a while. She looked around, trying to process the fact that, even with the pain of losing Miguel still so alive within her, there was something good silently but firmly emerging. She got up carefully, almost silently, not to wake Levi, who was sleeping deeply by her side. His serene face reflected the innocence and purity that still remained in him, despite everything he had already lived through. She watched him for a moment, a mixture of love and sadness. The softness of his sleep contrasted with the storm of feelings inside her. He still didn't know the weight the world could impose on a child, but she felt she needed to protect him from all of that, and now more than ever. She didn't want to see him suffer like his brother had suffered. The work as an attendant at the hospital would start soon, but for now she felt grateful for having something she didn't imagine she would have again. A safe place to rest, even if it was a simple house without luxury or comfort. It was a modest but significant achievement. She allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the peace that enveloped her, a breath of relief that already seemed so distant in her life. The bed she was on wasn't the most comfortable, and the house itself was small and cramped, but still, it seemed like a refuge compared to what she had lived on the streets. Sometimes, it was in the little things that life surprised. As the soft morning light streamed in through the broken window, she watched the shadows dance on the walls. The silence of the house enveloped her, and for a moment, the outside world seemed so far away. She felt a wave of gratitude take over her heart, a new feeling for her so laden with conflicting emotions. She didn't know what the future held for her, but at least now she had a base, a starting point, a space where she could build something for her and Levi, something real away from those cold and merciless streets. Levi hadn't woken up yet, and she stood there for a few minutes, lost in thought, thinking about how for her being a mother had meant so much suffering, so many nights of uncertainty, so many tears shed. The pain of losing Miguel still gripped her soul, but there was something more now, a hope as fragile as a flame trying to resist the wind. She knew that a human being's life was unpredictable and often cruel, but now she had a chance to start over. She wanted to give Levi what she could never give Miguel, the opportunity to live without the weight of so much pain and abandonment. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.